Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And today we're going to be posting a special video in honor of one of the most famous battles of American history, which oftentimes is overlooked. And that is the Battle of San Jacinto. Of course, it's only fitting considering that today is the 190th anniversary of said battle. Now, in 1836, news of the fall of the Alamo as well as the Goliad massacre had reached the ears of General Sam Houston commanding the Texian army. His contemporaries, upon hearing this, urged Houston to go out and confront the Mexican forces head-on. But General Sam Houston knew that his men were far too outnumbered and way undisciplined to even come close to facing the Mexican forces in open combat. He knew that if they had a chance to survive and to bring about the Republican government of Texas, that they would have to wait, bide their time, and pick the right moment to strike. And so he moved his men eastward, retreating across the Brazos and the Colorado rivers. All the while his contemporaries were urging him to turn around and fight. But Houston would not listen. He would not buckle to the pressure. And things got to the point where, at the further and further eastwards they retreated, even his men were starting to get fed up with Houston's caution. And so mutiny was being threatened. Mutiny was on the horizon. Ironically, though, we see that while all this is going on, including the runaway scrape, wherein civilians were retreating eastwards just as fast as Sam Houston's forces were, well, the current provisional government of the Republic of Texas was retreating almost as fast, if not faster, than Houston's forces were. And this was comprised of some of the very same men who were urging Houston to stand and fight. But Houston, again, would not buckle. Finally, as they got further and further into East Texas, Houston heard that the Mexican forces, especially in regards to those under the command of Santa Anna, were right on his heels. And between that and the threat of mutiny, which was ever lurking in the shadows, Houston knew that he had to do something. He had to act quick, or else there would be no army and no Texas to fight for. And so, when they were camped near Lynch's Ferry, along Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River, Sam Houston counseled with his other commanding officers. And finally, a plan was made that the next morning, April 21st, they would attack. Now, General Santa Anna had received some intelligence of Houston's whereabouts, his movements, and even his particular attack plans. But we see that he didn't really take it to heart all that much. But he did go ahead and set up breastworks, and in fact, we see that Santa Anna was expecting a Texian assault on his defensive position in the morning of April 21st. But Houston held his ground. He waited, and he lulled the enemy into a false sense of security. So much so that by 3:30 in the afternoon, we see that Santa Anna, along with the rest of the Mexican encampment, had relaxed their guard, and some had even started to take a siesta. It was at that point that Sam Houston decided to strike a blow for Texas and independence. And at that point, the armies of the Texian forces marched across the field with the twin sister cannons being brought forward through the middle. And these were a gift from the people of Ohio. Well, interestingly, we see that although the field is relatively wide open at the San Jacinto battle site, that there is a slight rise that leads up to where the Mexican forces were. And so, Sam Houston's forces were able to cover a good distance of that battlefield undetected before they crested the top of the knoll, and it was there that the Twin Sisters were positioned, as well as the infantry and the cavalry. Now, part of the cavalry was comprised of Juan Seguin and his Tejanos, whom Sam Houston had asked that they stay behind, lest they be mistaken for enemy soldiers and killed due to friendly fire. But Juan Seguin grew incensed at this, and he said, "Senor, if we do not fight today, and if we lose, then we will have no homes to return to." And so with that, Sam Houston withdrew the order. But as a safety measure, Juan Seguin and others, they ended up putting slips of paper or playing cards in their hats to identify themselves and set themselves apart from the other Mexican soldados. And then it grew quiet on the battlefield. And Sam Houston, riding upon his gray horse Saracen, turned to Hockley's artillery in command of the twin sisters and roared, "Fire!" And nothing happened. He turned around again and hollered, "I said fire!" And with that, the twin sisters roared to life, smashing into the breastworks of the Mexican army, tearing them apart with canister, broken horseshoes, rusty nails, pieces of glass, whatever these men could fit into canvas bags to make their own version of grape shot. And with that, the Battle of San Jacinto was on. Now, the Mexican army was panicking from the deadly accurate rifle fire of the Texian army. In fact, so much so that there was hardly any defense put up at the breastworks themselves. And once the Texians had shot their rifles or their muskets, they charged across the field using their rifles as clubs and also using pistols, bowie knives, tomahawks to deadly effect. Now, it's at this point in the battle we see that General Santa Anna, who was caught completely off guard, panicked. And one source says that he simply just wandered about the camp for a few seconds in absolute confusion, that afterwards he just got on a horse and rode away. But we'll talk about him and what happened to him after he left the scene of battle here in just a moment. But we do see that General Manuel Castrillon, who was one of the elder commanders in Santa Anna's army, he refused to give up his position and surrender it to the enemy. In all his years of soldiering, he had never once turned his back to the enemy force. And he said, "I am too old to start now." And with that, he crossed his arms in defiance and waited for the enemy onslaught to come. And sure enough, the Texian army, they fired into the ranks of the Mexican soldiers, and they riddled Castrillon's body with bullets. Now at this point, it was a wanton slaughter. It only took 18 minutes for the Texian army to actually overrun the breastworks and defensive positions set forth by Santa Anna's army. But that was not the only part of the fighting, although most people remember just solely the 18 minutes of battle. No, afterwards it was hours, at least 6 to 7 hours of nothing but madness, chaos, and wanton slaughter. And we see that in many cases where some of the commanding officers tried to actually get a hold of their men and control them and call a halt to the madness. They'd say, "Men, please, please stop this madness. Take prisoners." And the men would say, "All right, boys, we know how to take prisoners. Take your rifles and club them left and right and knock their brains out." And we even see that at one point there was a poor Mexican drummer boy who both his legs had been broken, and he clung to the legs of one of the Texian soldiers and begged for his life while also pleading to the Mother Mary to save him. And with that, the Texian soldier put his pistol right up to his head and blew his brains out. Again, it was absolute madness and chaos. The men, they were upset. They were releasing their pent-up fury because after what happened at the Alamo and Goliad, the slaughter of their countrymen, they had to retreat for weeks. And now finally the time had come to vent their fury. And it was at one point in the battle that one of the commanding officers asked that his men stop killing the fugitives, the soldados. And one of the soldiers looked up at his officer and said, "Sir, if God Almighty was to come down from heaven right now and tell me to stop killing yellow bellies, I would not do so." And it is said that on that very same day, as the Mexican soldiers tried to retreat through the swamps and through Peggy's Lake, that the waters ran red with blood. And towards the end of the actual battle itself, Sam Houston had been trying to bring his men back under control because he knew that if they spread out too far, that any possible advance forces from the Mexican army, led by Filosola or Urrea, would absolutely undo everything that they had done within just a matter of 18 minutes. So he was trying to get them back to regroup. But as the story has it, at one point, Sam Houston looked off in the distance and he saw a column of Mexican soldiers marching towards their position. And with that, he threw up his hands and said, "All is lost, my God, all is lost." But at the behest of one of his other officers, Houston put his eye up to a spyglass, and when he looked through, he found that it was Secretary of War Thomas Rusk, who was marching back basically a whole regiment of captured Mexican soldados. And with that, one of the officers joked and said, well, now it looks like Thomas Rusk has a respectable army. Now, as the slaughter had progressed throughout the hours, the men grew gradually tired, and so they did in fact begin to take captives, which they put into corrals in their camp. But the one captive who they were desperately trying to find, but could not be found anywhere, was Santa Anna. For Santa Anna had disguised himself as a soldado and hid out in the swamps near Peggy's Lake throughout the night. A mosquito-infested one, to be sure. But the next day, as scouts and sorties were sent out to try and mop up any of the backwash of the battle and take more prisoners, it was then that they unknowingly captured Santa Anna. And it was not until he was brought into camp where the rest of the prisoners were being held that the Mexican soldados recognized him, despite his soldier's garb, despite his disguise. And they stood up as a sign of respect and were said to be heard murmuring, El Presidente, El Presidente. And it was at that moment they knew that they had captured Santa Anna. And within a matter of moments, he was taken to Sam Houston. Of course, some people wanted to go ahead and string him up from a tree and hang him. But Sam Houston would have none of that. He didn't want to settle for blood. He'd rather settle for Texas. And so, in an attempt to spare his life, Santa Anna signed over the lands of Texas to Sam Houston, thus gaining independence for Texas. And of course, as I'm sure you all probably know, and I would be remiss if I forgot, on April 21st, 1836, the battle cry that was on everyone's lips as they charged across the field of San Jacinto was "Remember Goliad" and "Remember the Alamo!"